The fluorescent light above the DMV counter buzzed like it had a grudge against me personally. I'd been standing in that line for 2 hours and 40 minutes, holding a manila envelope full of documents I'd photocopied at the public library because my printer ran out of ink 3 months ago and I couldn't afford a new cartridge. I had $18 in my checking account. I had a notice from my landlord taped to my apartment door saying I had until Friday to come up with March rent or he was changing the locks. And I had a job interview at a hospital cafeteria at 4 p.m. that required a valid Massachusetts driver's license, which mine had expired 6 weeks ago because I couldn't afford the renewal fee until this Tuesday's paycheck cleared. That's what I was thinking about when the clerk took my fingerprints. Not my whole life. Not anything important. Just whether the bus to Cambridge would get me to the interview on time. The woman behind the bulletproof glass was maybe 50, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a coffee stain on her cardigan that she hadn't noticed yet. She rolled my thumb across the digital scanner and frowned at her screen. She did it again. She typed something. She frowned harder. "Ma'am, can you step over to Windows 7, please? Is something wrong with my paperwork? Windows 7. Right now." I've been told to step somewhere 1,000 times in my life. Step outside. Step away from the counter. Step into the office, please. Your check bounced again. I knew the tone. I picked up my envelope and walked to Windows 7, and I was already rehearsing the apology in my head, already calculating which bill I could skip this month to fix whatever this new disaster was. The woman at Windows 7 didn't look up at me. She was on the phone, speaking very quietly, and her free hand was making a small circular gesture I didn't understand. Behind her, through a glass partition, I saw a man in a charcoal suit straighten up from a desk and start walking toward us. He wasn't fast. He wasn't slow. He was deliberate in a way that made the back of my neck cold. I tried to set my envelope on the counter. The clerk's hand shot out and pressed it flat. "Ma'am, I need you to stay exactly where you are. Don't move. Don't reach for anything in your bag. Excuse me? Please." That was when I heard it. A soft electronic chirp from somewhere above me, and then a slow red pulse beginning to throb against the ceiling tiles. Not loud, not screaming. Just a quiet, patient red light the way an ambulance looks when it's parked. 2 security officers I hadn't noticed before began moving toward the counter from opposite ends of the room, and their hands weren't on their weapons, but their hands were ready. The way hands get ready. The man in the charcoal suit reached Windows 7. He didn't speak to the clerk. He looked at me. I want to be honest about what I felt in that second, because I've thought about it every day since. I wasn't afraid. I was tired. I was so tired, and I remember thinking, whatever this is, please let it be quick. I have a bus to catch. That's the truth. I thought I was about to lose a job I hadn't even gotten yet over some fraudulent identity thing, some bureaucratic mistake, some final cruelty from a universe that had been finding new ways to be cruel to me for as long as I could remember. "Mom?" the man said. His voice was very soft. "My name is Special Agent Hollis Whitaker. I'm with the FBI. I need you to come with me to a private room. You're not in any trouble. You're not under arrest. I just need to ask you some questions, and I promise we'll get you something to eat and drink, and we'll go as slow as you need to go." That was when I started shaking. Not from fear. From the word promise. I couldn't remember the last time a man in a position of authority had used that word with me and meant it. The room he took me to wasn't at the DMV. It was 3 blocks away, in a federal building I'd walked past 100 times without ever knowing what was inside. He drove me there in an unmarked sedan, and on the way he bought me a coffee from a Dunkin' drive-thru, and he didn't ask me a single question. He just let me drink the coffee. He let me look out the window. He let me exist for 10 minutes in a car that smelled like leather and was warmer than my apartment had been all winter. In the office, he sat across from me at a small wooden table. There was a folder on the table, but he didn't open it. He poured me a glass of water from a pitcher and slid a granola bar across to me, and I realized I hadn't eaten since the day before, and I tore the wrapper open with my teeth because my hands were too unsteady to manage the foil. "Take your time," he said. "What did I do?" "Nothing. I want to be very clear about that. You have done absolutely nothing wrong." "Then why am I here?" He put both his hands flat on the table. His wedding ring was simple and worn smooth. He had reading glasses pushed up on his head and a haircut that was a few weeks past due, and he looked at me the way I imagined a kind uncle would look at a niece if I'd ever had a kind uncle, which I hadn't. "The fingerprints you gave at the DMV this morning matched a record in a federal database. The record is from 1994. It belongs to a missing child named Eleanor Bridget Ashworth, who was 19 months old when she was taken from a public garden in Newport, Rhode Island. Her parents are Theodora and James Ashworth. James is a federal judge. Theodora is the founder of the Ashworth Maritime Foundation. They have spent 31 years and approximately $14 million looking for their daughter." I heard the words. I understood each one individually. They didn't connect. "Mom," he said, very gently, "the match is conclusive. We reran it 3 times. I need you to understand what I'm telling you. The woman you've been told you are, I don't know who told you that, or what your life has looked like, but the person sitting across from me right now is Eleanor Ashworth. You were taken when you were a baby. You were never legally adopted. You were never legally renamed. There is no record of you anywhere in this country between June of 1994 and the moment you appeared in a Springfield public school in 1999 under the name Rosalind May Carver. I want to describe what happened in my body when he said that name, Rosalind May Carver, the name I had answered to my entire life. The name my stepmother had screamed at me from the bottom of the basement stairs when I was 9 years old and she'd locked me down there for spilling juice on the carpet. The name on my expired driver's license, my last 3 pay stubs, my eviction notice. The name I had hated so much as a teenager that I'd tried to legally change it at 17 and been told by the clerk at the courthouse that I needed $300 and a notarized signature from a parent, neither of which I had. It didn't crack. It didn't shatter. It just fell off me. Like a coat I'd been wearing for so long I'd forgotten it wasn't my skin. Everything made sense. That's what I want to say. Everything made sense. Every time my stepmother had told me I was lucky she'd taken me in. Every time my stepfather had refused to let me see my own birth certificate, said it was in a safe deposit box, said I didn't need it for school, said I was making everything difficult on purpose. The cold, careful distance my stepmother kept from me even when she was being affectionate in public. The way my stepfather, Dennis Carver, had looked at me sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Not with love, not with hate, but with the watchful, calculating expression of a man checking the lid on a jar. He hadn't been raising a stepdaughter. He had been guarding a secret. I started to cry and Agent Whitaker pushed a box of tissues toward me, and he didn't say it's okay because he was a man who understood that telling someone it's okay in that moment would be the cruelest possible lie. He just waited. He let me cry. He let me make the sounds I needed to make, and at one point he stepped out of the room and came back with another granola bar and a small bottle of orange juice, and he placed them in front of me like an offering. "Your parents are on a plane," he said when I could hear him again. "They've been waiting for this call for 31 years. They will be at Logan in about 4 hours. We've arranged a secure suite for you to wait in. There's food, there's a shower, there are clothes if you want to change. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to make any decisions today, except whether you'd like to meet them when they land." I nodded. I couldn't speak yet. "There is something else I need to tell you," he said, "and I am sorry to do it now, when you've already had so much. But it's important, and I would rather you hear it from me than from anyone else." He opened the folder. "Dennis and Linnea Carver are not your relatives. They were paid to take you. We've been building the case for 8 months, a different lead, an unrelated investigation into a series of private adoptions facilitated by an attorney named Bertram Crowell, who died in 2011. Crowell's records were sealed for a decade and finally released last spring. There are wire transfers to an account in Dennis Carver's name beginning in November of 1994 and continuing in declining amounts for the next 16 years. The total is just over $600,000. We believe the money came from a third party who wanted you to disappear, but that part of the investigation is still active and I can't share more right now. I stopped crying. I want to be clear about that. I stopped crying instantly because there was no room in my chest for crying anymore. There was only a hot, white, perfectly clean feeling, like someone had run a wire through me and connected it to a generator. $600,000. I had slept on a folding cot in the unfinished part of the basement from age 6 until age 18. I had eaten dinner standing up in the kitchen most nights because the dining room was for family, and Dennis had decided, with a kind of legal precision, that I was not family. I had worn my stepsister Brielle's hand-me-downs that were already 2 sizes too small for her when she handed them down. I had been told every single day of my life that I was a charity case, that Dennis and the Nia had taken me in out of Christian duty when my mother, a fictional drug addict named Marlene, who had supposedly died in a car accident, had abandoned me at a fire station. There was no Marlene. There was no fire station. There was a man with $600,000 and a folding cot in his basement. I'd like to meet my parents, I said. My voice was very even. I was surprised by how even it was. Agent Whitaker nodded, and he was about to say something else when his radio chirped. He glanced at it, and I watched his face change in a way I would think about for a long time afterward. It didn't show alarm. It showed something more careful than alarm. It showed the expression of a man who had been doing this job for 25 years and had just recognized a problem he'd seen before. "Stay here," he said. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me. I'll knock 3 times, pause, then twice." He left. I sat alone in the room for what I later learned was 11 minutes. I drank the rest of the orange juice. I opened the folder he had left on the table because he hadn't told me not to, and I looked at a photograph of a woman who was 62 years old and had my eyes. She had my chin. She had the small crooked tooth I'd been ashamed of my whole life, the one I'd never been able to afford to fix. Her name was Theodora Ashworth. She was wearing a navy blue sweater and standing on a dock with a black Labrador, and she was laughing, and I knew without being told that she was my mother, because the laugh in the photograph was the laugh I made when no one was watching, the laugh I had taught myself to suppress because Dennis said it sounded like a horse. There was a knock at the door. 3 knocks. A pause. Then a 4th knock, and a 5th. Wrong rhythm. I held my breath. I was 29 years old, and I had spent my entire life learning to be very quiet, and I used every skill of that quietness to sit perfectly still in that chair while the door handle began to rattle. "Rosalind." The voice on the other side was my stepfather's. "Rosalind, honey, it's me. You're all going to come out of there now." I have to explain something. My stepfather had never called me honey in 23 years. Not once. He had called me girl. He had called me Rosalind. He had called me a parasite once when he'd been drinking, but he had never called me honey. The fact that he was calling me honey now told me everything I needed to know about what he intended to do to me when that door opened. "I have a warrant, Rosalind, out of Springfield District Court. Grand larceny. You stole jewelry from your stepmother's dresser last weekend when you came by for dinner. I'm here as a courtesy to the federal officers. They've agreed to let me take you back to Hampton County so we can get this cleared up. Open the door, sweetheart, before this gets worse." I hadn't been to their house in 2 years. I hadn't had dinner with them in 8. The lie wasn't just a lie. It was a confession that he knew I was about to know everything, and he had driven up from Springfield in the last 4 hours with a forged warrant in his pocket. Because the moment he heard the FBI had picked me up, he understood exactly what was happening and exactly how little time he had to stop it. He hadn't come to arrest me. He had come to kill me before my parents landed. I want you to understand. I knew to understand. I knew to the way you know a hot stove. I didn't have to think about it. The man on the other side of that door had been planning this contingency for 31 years. He had a basement in his house where a folding cot had sat empty for 11 years since I'd left at 18. And he had never moved that cot, and I had never understood why, and now I did. I did not open the door. I sat in the chair. I watched the handle rattle. I heard him try to keep his voice calm, and then I heard the calm crack at the edges, and then I heard footsteps, running footsteps, a lot of them, and Agent Whitaker's voice in the hallway, very loud, ordering my stepfather to put his hands behind his head and step away from the door. There was a scuffle. I heard a body hit the wall. I heard my stepfather screaming about his rights, about his warrant, about how he was a concerned guardian and the FBI had kidnapped his daughter. And I sat in my chair and I listened to him use the word daughter for what I realized was the first time in his life. He had never called me his daughter, not once in 23 years. He had called me his stepdaughter, his ward, his obligation. The word daughter had been too expensive for him to spend. He was spending it now because he was about to die in a federal building if he didn't. And even then it sounded fake. Agent Whitaker knocked. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 knocks. I opened the door. My stepfather was on the floor in the hallway, on his stomach, with his hands cuffed behind his back. He was 61 years old and his bald spot was sunburned, and there was a piece of paper crumpled under his cheek that I assumed was the forged warrant. He looked up at me. His face was the color of an old brick. "Rosalind," he said, "honey, tell them you're my daughter." I looked at him for a long time. I had imagined this moment in 100 different vague shapes for most of my life. I had imagined what I would say to him if I ever had power. I had written speeches in my head while I was scrubbing toilets at the motel where I worked the overnight shift in my early 20s. None of those speeches came to me. What came to me was very simple. "My name is Eleanor Bridget Ashworth," I said, "and you are going to spend the rest of your life in a federal prison." Then I closed the door, and I sat back down, and I waited for my mother. The legal part took longer than the emotional part. I'll tell you what happened because the comments on stories like mine always want to know, and they deserve to know. The forged warrant alone was a federal felony, falsifying a court document, attempting to obstruct a federal investigation, attempting to remove a federal witness from federal custody. They added attempted kidnapping the same afternoon, because the U.S. Attorney's Office takes a hard line on people who try to abduct federally protected witnesses, and they don't care if you have a star on your jacket. Dennis wasn't even a sheriff, he was a retired corrections officer who'd been moonlighting as a process server, and his fake credentials added several more charges to the pile. But the part I want you to understand, the part that mattered, was what came after. The kidnapping itself was 1994. Federal kidnapping has no statute of limitations when the victim is a minor. None. Anyone telling you otherwise is wrong, and I want to say that clearly because in the days after my story started to be reported, a lot of people on the internet seemed to believe the opposite, and I want the record to be right. Dennis Carver was charged with the original kidnapping, with conspiracy to commit kidnapping, with receipt of money for the kidnapping of a child, and with 23 years of related fraud, identity theft, and benefit collection, because he had been claiming me as a dependent on his taxes the entire time, while my parents had been paying private investigators in 3 countries to find me. My stepmother, Linnea Carver, was charged as a co-conspirator. Their daughter Brielle, who was 4 years older than me and had known something was wrong her whole life and had said nothing, was not charged with anything, but she lost the house when the assets were seized. And the last I heard, she was living in a studio apartment in Holyoke and working at a tanning salon. I do not feel sorry for her. I want to feel sorry for her sometimes, because she was a child once too, and a child raised by Dennis Carver did not have an easy life either. But I cannot manufacture a feeling I do not have. The money was the strangest part. $600,000 over 16 years, plus interest, plus the property they had accumulated with it, a house in Springfield, 2 vehicles, a small lake cabin in New Hampshire, a retirement account Dennis had been carefully feeding for years. None of it had been theirs. The doctrine the federal prosecutors used is called constructive trust, and I'm going to explain it because it changed my life and I want other people to know it exists. When someone obtains money or property through fraud and the victim is identifiable, the law does not consider that property to belong to the person holding it. They are merely holding it in trust for the victim. There is no statute of limitations on recovering it, because civil claims for the benefit of a victim who is a minor do not start their clock until the victim is legally aware of the fraud. I became aware of the fraud the morning of February 14th when Agent Whitaker opened a folder on a small wooden table. The clock on my civil claim started ticking then. 18 months later, every dollar Dennis Carver had ever earned from selling me, and every dollar he had grown from those dollars was returned to me by court order. It came to just over $1.1 million after appreciation. I gave half of it to a non-profit in Newport that helps families of missing children. The other half I used to pay off the back rent I'd owed on the apartment I'd been about to be evicted from, and then I moved out of that apartment, and then I went to college, which is something I had never been able to afford to consider before. The man who had paid Dennis to take me, the third-party agent Whitaker mentioned at the very beginning, turned out to be a business partner of my father's who had wanted to discredit and isolate my parents during a contested merger in the early 90s. He thought the trauma would break them. He thought my father would step down from the bench. He was dead by the time we identified him. He died of a heart attack in 2007 in a hotel in Singapore. I cannot punish a dead man. I have made my peace with this, although it took longer than I want to admit. I want to tell you about the airport, because that's the part of the story I think about most. My mother got off the plane first. I was standing in a small private room at Logan with Agent Whitaker, and the door opened, and a woman walked in who was 62 years old and had the laugh I had taught myself not to laugh, and she stopped about 6 feet from me. She didn't run. She didn't reach for me. She just stood there, with her hands at her sides, and she looked at my face, and she said, "I knew it was you. The minute they called, I knew." And then she said, "May I?" That's what undid me, that she asked. That after 31 years of looking for me, after $14 million and 3 private investigators on 3 continents, she stood in front of her own daughter and asked if she could touch her, because she understood without anyone telling her that the woman in front of her had spent her whole life being touched without permission and ignored without permission and named without permission. I said yes. I said yes, and my mother put her arms around me, and my father came into the room a moment later, and he was crying so hard he couldn't speak. And the 3 of us stood in a hotel-style Federal Arrival lounge and held on to each other for what Agent Whitaker later told me was 41 minutes. He timed it. He told me afterward that he had timed it because he'd been waiting his whole career for a reunion that long, and he wanted to remember exactly how long it lasted. My parents are not perfect people. I want to say that because the story makes them sound like saints, and they aren't. My father is a difficult man with a very precise sense of right and wrong, and we have argued about almost everything in the 4 years since I came home. My mother is sometimes too careful with me, the way you'd be careful with a very expensive vase you thought you'd lost. I have a brother I didn't know about, 2 years younger than me, named Whit. He resented me at first, in ways he was honest enough to admit, because he had grown up as the only child of a grief that took up all the air in every room. We are working on it. I changed my name back legally to Eleanor Brigitte Ashworth in the fall of that first year. I kept Rosalind as a middle name in the end. Not because I love it, I don't, but because the woman who survived 23 years as Rosalind May Carver is the woman who walked into that DMV with $18 and an envelope of library photocopies and a job interview to catch. And she is the reason I am alive. And I am not going to throw her away just because she was given to me by people who hated me. She was mine too. I think about Dennis sometimes. He is 64 now and he is in a federal facility in Pennsylvania. And he will die there. His appeals have all failed. He wrote me a letter last year through his attorney asking for forgiveness, and I read it carefully, and I put it in a drawer, and I did not respond. Forgiveness is a thing I might give him someday or might not. I have not decided. The thing I want him to understand, the thing I would write back to him if I ever do, is that he did not raise me. He stored me. He kept me in his basement the way you keep a problem you're not ready to deal with. And the version of me he thought he had broken, the small, grateful, frightened girl who slept on a folding cot and apologized for breathing, was never the whole of me. She was just the part he could see. The rest of me was always there. The laugh, the crooked tooth, the eyes I share with the woman in the navy blue sweater on the dock. He kept me in a basement for 23 years, and the part of me he was guarding never even touched the ground. People ask me, now that some time has passed, what I learned. They want a clean answer. They want one sentence they can pin to their refrigerator. I don't have one. What I have is the long way around. I learned that cruelty almost always has a reason underneath it, and the reason is almost never about you. For 23 years I thought my stepfather hated me because I was unlovable. That belief shaped every choice I made, every job I settled for, every relationship I walked away from before anyone could leave me first, every dollar I didn't ask for, because asking felt like proof I was a burden. The reason he hated me had nothing to do with who I was. It had to do with what I cost him to keep and what I might cost him to release. The minute I understood that, I stopped carrying his version of me. That was the first thing. The second thing is that nothing in my life was an accident, and nothing was destiny either. Cause and effect were always running. Dennis Carver took a payment, and the payment bought him a house, and the house had a basement, and the basement had a cot, and the cot held a child who grew into a woman who walked into a DMV one Tuesday morning because her license had expired. Every step of that chain was a choice somebody made. The man who paid him chose. Dennis chose. My stepmother chose. The school clerk who looked at my paperwork in 1999 and decided not to ask questions chose. And eventually I chose to give the fingerprint, to sit in the chair, to not open the door when he came for me. The story wasn't fate. The story was a long sequence of decisions, and the last decision was mine, and that is the part I want anyone watching this to remember. I learned the difference between gratitude and surrender. For most of my life I had been taught those were the same word. Be grateful for the scraps. Be grateful for the cot. Be grateful that anybody took you in at all. Real gratitude. The kind you feel when Agent Whitaker buys you a coffee at a Dunkin' drive-thru and lets you exist for 10 minutes without asking anything in return, does not require you to make yourself smaller. If someone needs you to shrink in order to receive their kindness, what they are offering is not kindness, it is rent. And the last thing, the hardest thing, is that the strength I needed had been inside me the whole time. I didn't grow it during the 11 minutes I sat alone in that room. I had built it scrubbing motel bathrooms at 3 a.m. I had built it eating cold sandwiches standing up in a kitchen I wasn't allowed to sit in. I had built it every time I did not believe what Dennis told me about myself, even when I had no proof he was wrong. Nobody hands you that. You earn it in the dark, one quiet refusal at a time, and one day a door rattles and you find out you've been ready for years.